I never wanted to be a doctor. That might sound ungrateful, even selfish, considering how many people dream of entering the medical field, dedicating their lives to healing others. Medicine is noble, respectable, an institution upheld by centuries of knowledge and sacrifice. But for me, it was a gilded cage, a carefully planned future that had been decided long before I had the chance to discover who I really was. My name is Sophia Chen, and for the past 6 years, I have lived a double life. To my parents, I am Dr. Chen, the dutiful daughter who followed the path they paved, the promising young doctor who excelled in every class, every rotation, every grueling night shift. But in another world, the world that truly feels like mine, I am Aurora Night, a name whispered in elite art circles, attached to paintings that sell for millions and hang in the most prestigious galleries in New York. 2 names, 2 lives, existing parallel yet completely separate until now. This morning, the weight of my secret pressed down on me harder than ever as I stood in the newly renovated wing of Metropolitan General Hospital, a place that had been my parents' domain for over 30 years. Their pride and joy, this hospital was an extension of them, every hallway and operating room a testament to their legacy. Today, the hospital was unveiling its Healing Through Art initiative, a program designed to bring color and emotion into sterile medical spaces, fostering an atmosphere that nurtured both the body and the soul. And there, in the center of the main lobby, stood my latest piece, a massive, breathtaking canvas, an explosion of color, raw emotion transformed into pigment and texture. It was abstract yet alive, imbued with the energy of sleepless nights, the silent struggles of patience, the weight of expectations, and the relentless drive to create something meaningful. Purchased anonymously through my gallery, the painting had sold for $2 million, money that was funneled directly back into the hospital's pediatric care program, my contribution, my unspoken gift. But as I stood beside my mother, listening to her critique my work with the same surgical precision she applied to everything, I felt the sharp sting of irony. "I don't understand modern art," she said, her brow furrowed as she scrutinized the strokes, the deliberate chaos I had spent weeks perfecting. $2 million for splashes of paint? The hospital board must be losing their minds. If only she knew, if only she realized those splashes of paint would fund an entire year of pediatric treatments, would buy life-saving equipment, would ensure that the children in this very hospital received the best care possible. But of course, she didn't know. She didn't know because she had never looked beyond the doctor's coat I wore, never considered that I could be something more than what she had carefully molded me into. My father joined us, his white coat, pristine, the embodiment of everything I was expected to become. He studied the painting for a moment, then exhaled, his expression unreadable. "At least it adds some color to the place," he muttered, though I would have preferred they spent the money on new equipment. I bit my tongue, forcing myself to remain silent, though the memory of the night I had created that painting flooded my mind. I had just come off a brutal 36-hour shift, exhausted to the point of delirium, my body aching from the relentless demands of residency. Instead of collapsing into bed like a normal person, I had gone straight to my studio. The paint had flowed freely that night, emotion spilling onto the canvas in a way that words never could. Every stroke had been fueled by frustration, by the weight of expectation, by the crushing feeling of living a life that wasn't entirely my own. And yet, despite it all, I had created something undeniable, something that resonated so deeply with collectors that it had become one of my most expensive pieces to date. But my story, this tangled web of medicine and art, duty and passion, didn't begin in that studio. It began 10 years ago when I was 18 and dared to dream of something beyond the life my parents had meticulously mapped out for me. Absolutely not. My father's voice had thundered through our home that night, shaking the very walls, making the fine china in the display cabinet tremble. No daughter of mine will waste her life painting pictures. I stood in our pristine living room, clutching the acceptance letter from the Art Institute of Chicago in my trembling hands. A full scholarship, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Proof that I wasn't just good, I was exceptional. 3 national youth art competitions, each one under a pseudonym, each validating what I had known deep in my bones since childhood. I was meant to create. But none of that mattered. Not to my parents. Dad, My mother, always composed, always the master of controlled disappointment, didn't even look at me as she spoke. Sophia, we've invested everything in preparing you for medical school. The extra classes, the summer programs, the MCAT prep courses. This isn't up for discussion. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I never asked for those things. My father cut me off before I could say another word. You think art will give you a stable future? You think you can support yourself drawing pictures? He scoffed, shaking his head. Look at your cousin William. He tried to be a musician. Now he's 35, living in his parents' basement. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them about the paintings I had already sold online, about the gallery owner who had seen my work and wanted to represent me, about the fire that burned inside me every time I picked up a brush. But I knew it wouldn't matter. To them, success had only one definition, and it wore a white coat. The acceptance letter crumpled in my fist. I had a choice to make. Defy my parents and risk losing my family or find another way. That night, I made a decision that would shape the next decade of my life. I wrote to the Art Institute declining their offer. Then I accepted my place at Preston Medical School, my parents' alma mater, their legacy continuing through me. But I also sent an email to the gallery owner under a new name. I'll need to work in absolute secrecy, I wrote. No public appearances. No photos, no interviews, but I'll keep painting. His response came within hours. Intriguing. Mystery can be a powerful marketing tool. Send me your next piece and we'll begin. And so my double life began. By day, I threw myself into medical school, memorizing human anatomy with the same meticulousness I once applied to color theory. By night, in a small, dimly lit studio across town, I painted with reckless abandon, my exhaustion and stress bleeding onto the canvas in ways I could never admit aloud. The first year was brutal. Medical school was as demanding as my parents had promised, a relentless grind that threatened to consume me. But instead of breaking me, it fueled my art. My paintings became more visceral, more raw, capturing emotions I didn't have the words to express. Critics called them haunting, surgical in their precision yet deeply emotive, almost painfully intimate. If only they knew how many nights I spent studying cadavers before picking up a brush. My first major sale came during my second year, a triptych that sold for $180,000. I celebrated alone in my studio that night, dancing in the flickering glow of city lights, knowing I couldn't tell a soul. My parents called shortly after, beaming about how proud they were of my perfect pathology exam score. I let them talk, all while knowing that, in another world, I had just been hailed as the most exciting new voice in contemporary art. For years, I balanced on the razor's edge, excelling in medicine while Aurora Night became a sensation. My paintings sold for increasingly exorbitant amounts. The mystery surrounding my identity only heightened my allure. Collectors speculated endlessly. Who was this enigmatic artist whose work bled with so much raw emotion? And all the while, my parents continued to boast about their brilliant doctor-daughter, oblivious to the fact that every time they passed a prestigious gallery, they were walking past pieces created by their own child. Until now, until this morning, when they unknowingly stood in front of a painting worth millions, criticizing the very thing that had kept me sane all these years. And for the first time, I wondered, was it time to step out of the shadows? The weight of secrets has a peculiar way of settling into the bones, making every movement heavier, every breath drawn with a careful deliberation. as though exhaling too hard might shatter the fragile construct of a lie. I'd grown accustomed to that weight, to the balancing act of maintaining two identities, each carefully constructed, meticulously separated, like oil and water forced to coexist in the same glass without ever truly merging. But as the days passed, the walls I had built between those identities thinned, stretched by the sheer force of circumstance, by the creeping presence of doubt, by the gnawing sense that I could not maintain this equilibrium forever. The city moved around me in its predictable rhythm, its pulsing energy disguising the tension that curled within my chest, a tension that grew tighter each time I felt eyes lingering on me a moment too long, each time I heard a voice calling my name in a way that suggested recognition where there should be none. Mornings were the worst, when the fragile haze of sleep had not yet fully lifted, when my mind hovered between realities, uncertain of which face to wear. The apartment where I lived, the one tied to the life I presented to the world, was sparse, meticulously curated to avoid contradictions. It bore no traces of the double life I led, no artifacts that could unravel the careful story I had woven, but it was also hollow. A place where I existed rather than lived, where every object served a purpose, but none carried meaning. I often found myself staring at my own reflection in the mirror, searching for cracks in the facade, wondering if the person staring back at me was the real Sophia or merely another illusion crafted to survive. The uncertainty gnawed at me, an unrelenting whisper in the back of my mind that grew louder with each passing day. Work was both a sanctuary and a battlefield. It provided structure, a rigid framework within which I could operate without the burden of improvisation. Numbers did not question motives. Calculations did not demand explanations. And yet, the very predictability of it sometimes made the illusion feel more fragile, as if at any moment someone might peer too closely, ask a question I could not answer without betraying myself. There were moments, fleeting but sharp, when I caught a colleague watching me with something unreadable in their expression, a hesitation in their words that suggested a question left unspoken. I told myself it was paranoia, that the more I allowed myself to entertain such thoughts, the more likely I was to unravel. But paranoia, once seeded, has a way of taking root, of winding itself into every interaction, turning even the most mundane moments into scenes of potential exposure. The city had always felt like an ally, a labyrinth of streets and distractions that allowed me to move unseen when I needed to. But even that illusion was beginning to wear thin. There was a night not long ago when I caught the reflection of a man in a storefront window, his silhouette familiar in a way that sent a slow chill down my spine. I did not turn, did not quicken my pace, but I felt the weight of his presence behind me, the certainty that I was being followed. My pulse thrummed in my throat, a slow, steady beat of warning, but I forced myself to maintain the illusion of normalcy, to follow the well-rehearsed routine that dictated my every movement. It was only when I reached my apartment, when I locked the door behind me and pressed my back against it, that I allowed myself to acknowledge the fear curling in my gut. He had not followed me inside. There had been no knock at the door, no sign that he had lingered outside. And yet I knew with certainty that he had been watching. It was a reminder, stark and unforgiving, that my walls were not as solid as I had once believed, that the separation between my two lives was fraying at the edges. I had always known that secrets, no matter how carefully kept, had a way of unraveling, but knowing and accepting were two different things, and I was not yet ready to face the inevitable. So I did what I always did. I reinforced the facade, stitched the seams of my carefully crafted identity back together, and convinced myself that I was still in control. But deep down, I knew. The clock was ticking, the walls were closing in, and sooner or later, the illusion would shatter. and when it did, I would have to face the consequences of the choices I had made. The days that followed blurred together, an indistinct haze of tension and rehearsed normalcy, each moment layered with the quiet awareness that my world was unraveling. I moved through my routines with meticulous precision, performing the motions of my life as though they alone could hold me together. The city outside my window continued its restless hum, oblivious to the slow collapse happening within me, the steady erosion of the identity I had so carefully constructed. Yet beneath the surface, I felt it, the slow, insidious weight of inevitability pressing against my ribs, tightening with every breath. The sense of being watched had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, a presence woven into the very fabric of my existence, lingering in the periphery of my vision, vanishing just as I turned to confront it. I knew better than to believe in coincidences, knew that the man I had glimpsed in the storefront window was no random passerby. But what I did not yet know, what gnawed at me in the long, sleepless hours of the night, was whether the past had finally caught up with me, or if this was something else entirely, something more insidious, more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that the sense of unease curling through my veins was the product of exhaustion, of too many nights spent locked in restless thought. But paranoia is a treacherous thing. It does not whisper. It shouts, drowning out reason, twisting every shadow into a threat, every stranger's glance into an accusation. I felt it at work, in the stolen glances of my colleagues, the brief hesitations in conversation, the way their voices dropped when I entered a room. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps I was projecting my own fears onto them. But the doubt had already taken root, spreading through me like ink spilled across a page, dark and inescapable. Even the city itself seemed to conspire against me, its familiar streets suddenly filled with unfamiliar faces, its rhythm off-kilter, distorted. There was nowhere to hide from it, no way to silence the gnawing certainty that I was being watched, that my every movement was being measured and analyzed, that somewhere, someone was waiting for me to make a mistake. And then, inevitably, I did. It was a small thing, barely a deviation from my carefully maintained script, but I knew, the moment it happened, that it was enough. I had been moving through the crowd, head down, posture calculated to blend, to disappear, when I felt it, that sharp, electric jolt of recognition, the unmistakable awareness of being seen. Not in the way one stranger notices another, but in the way one predator marks its prey. My breath hitched, but I did not turn, did not falter. To react would be to confirm suspicion, to seal my fate. Instead, I continued forward, my steps steady, measured, and yet the damage had already been done, because I knew, without question, without doubt, that I had been recognized, that whoever had been watching me was no longer content to linger in the shadows. They wanted me to know. That night, the walls of my apartment felt thinner, the air heavier, thick with the unspoken. I moved through the space in silence, my ears straining for a sound that did not belong, my fingers trembling as I reached for the glass of water on the kitchen counter. My reflection in the darkened window stared back at me, eyes wide, skin pale beneath the dim glow of the city lights. I felt a tremor in my chest, the kind that comes with knowing that the illusion has crumbled, that the game is over, that there is nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. And then, so soft it might have been imagined, I heard it, a rustling, the faintest scrape of fabric against wood. Someone was there. My mind splintered into 1,000 possibilities, each more damning than the last. Had they come for me now, in the dead of night, while the city slept? Or was this simply another warning, another reminder that I was not untouchable? My breath came shallow, rapid, but I forced myself to move, to reach for the knife hidden beneath the kitchen sink, my fingers tightening around the cold metal. And then, silence. as if whoever had been there had withdrawn, satisfied with the knowledge that I was afraid. Or perhaps it had been my imagination, a trick of paranoia, my own mind betraying me. But I knew better. The pieces were falling into place, the past bleeding into the present, and I could no longer pretend that I was safe. Morning arrived in a blur of exhaustion and frayed nerves, the world outside unchanged, indifferent to the quiet war raging inside me. I left the apartment before dawn, my bag slung over one shoulder, my eyes scanning the streets for any sign of the man I had seen. He was not there, but I knew he was watching. I could feel it, the way one can feel a storm in the air before the first drop of rain falls. It was only a matter of time before the facade shattered completely, before I was forced to confront whatever was coming. And when it did, I knew there would be no running, no more hiding. Because secrets, no matter how carefully buried, always have a way of coming to light, and mine was about to be exposed.